Over to you. Okay.
Sir, so should we start?
Yes, please.
All right, so we are going to start now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the DEH Seminar Series Fall 2020. My name is Radia Al-Rashid, and I'm going to be your anchor tonight. We'll also be live on Facebook from our official page, so whoever wants to join can absolutely connect with us through Facebook. Before we begin, may I request all of you to mute your devices. Thank you.
Okay, have we started recording? Okay, good. Please proceed.
We are extremely honored to feature Professor Almond for the second session of our fall lecture series. To welcome our guest and say a few words on the lecture series, may I request our Honorable Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Professor Shahjahan.
Thank you, Radia. And welcome to Ian, a virtual welcome to Ian to Dhaka once again. And I hope that this virtual visit it's just a prelude to longer, real visit before too long, now that the vaccine is on its way. It's a real pleasure to welcome Ian to our series of talks on the net. He is a remarkable scholar, a great friend, and he really embodies what we now call world literature or global literature, because if you look at the kind of work he has done, he spans different cultures, faiths, languages, continents, and his books include studies of deconstruction and Sufism, the reception of Islam in German thought, the thought of Anayrt Chaudhry, the first serious study of this idiosyncratic writer, and most recently, a book that is in press. It's a study of the literature set in hotels in different cultures. And that is what he's going to talk about today. It's a fascinating, angle on human life. The idea of looking at how writers have shown, depicted the human condition as it manifests itself in this very special ambience, the hotel. And I can assure my readers that they can expect a wonderful session that will be enlightening, entertaining, and thought-provoking. I don't want to take up any more time. All I want to say is that we all hope Ian enjoys his time with us, this virtual session with us, and I hope to see more of him in Dhaka in future. Thank you, Ian, for coming, and it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank both Kaiser and the people at ULab for giving me this time, and it's a great honor to be able to speak. I came a year ago, and I have very fond memories of Almond and all the really sort of really friendliness and hospitality I had there. So the feeling is definitely reciprocated. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about hotels and the hotel in world literature, and I'm going to try and keep it within 30 to 40 minutes so that we can, if people want to have sort of questions. And I'm just going to I'm going to try and keep it as quickly as possible without sort of getting too bogged down in the minutiae of the text. I'll say just a little bit about, it's a wider, and I'll probably kick off with just presenting the screen here. We're looking at three hotel novels. It's a chapter of a wider book called Decentering World Literature, which will be coming out with Whitledge next year. And I'm not plugging the book because we don't make, as academics, we don't make any money from this anyway. Everyone knows this. But I think it's important to say why I'm talking about Mexico, Turkey, and Bengal, Bangladesh, and West Bengal. The book is largely comes out of a series of frustrations with current concepts of world literature and world history. Concepts which I, and not myself, but I think many increasing number of scholars feel are overwhelmingly Euro-American in nature. I always begin by saying the West is 10% of the planet. Yeah, Europe and America are 10% of the planet. The non-West is not some sort of token minority that needs, it is the overwhelming majority of this world. So that really is the wider context here, that I'm trying, instead of theoretically deconstructing notions of world literature, really sort of trying to performatively engage with this through three non-Western regions. And those three regions are Turkey, Bengal, three literary traditions, if you like, Turkey, Bengal, and Mexico. There's about 5 topics that I choose. I look at melancholy, I look at the ghost story, I look at Orientalism, but one of those chapters is on the hotel. So that's really sort of where this is coming from today. It's a chapter within this wider text. Why the hotel? As Kaiser sort of pointed out at the beginning, there's something quite curious about the hotel. It's in a way, it's a collection, it's a box of stories, which I think what's curious about the hotel narrative is that it addresses simultaneously questions of the micro and the macro. So on the one hand, it's an accommodation of a whole series of miniature existences. And in a sense, it reflects the hotel itself, right? That that the hotel is an accommodation of particularities of like individual existences. And in many ways, what is interesting about the hotel in a macro political sense is that it sits on the cusp of a series of overlapping paradigms within modernity. So the most obvious thing to say here is that the hotel is largely a 19th century product of industrial and indeed even colonial modernity. It's a consequence of an increasingly bourgeois, the leisure needs of an increasing bourgeois travel class, of a kind of, it's certainly connected to empire. It's sort of, it in some ways could be seen as a facilitator of colonial influence. You don't need me to tell you how in most major South Asian cities, the main hotels always have these imperial sounding names. And I think also what's perhaps most interesting is that the hotel is a kind of moment of alienation. It's where you purchase alienation, if you like. You purchase for a limited amount of time, you purchase a space and a time in which you can separate yourself at your own expense from your community. And for that reason, perhaps it often has these seedy images, because the hotel, because you escape momentarily from your community in a hotel, it is a place which invites transgressive practices. So for all of these like very different reasons, the hotel tells us a great deal about larger issues, larger frameworks, socio-political frameworks, and indeed even, I would argue, theological and philosophical questions. And that's really sort of what we're gravitating to today. So we're looking at these three novels. Shankar, obviously the pen name from, I'm sure many people, even not just in West Bengal, but I'm sure some people in Bangladesh will know Shankar, which is the pen name of Mani Shankar Mukherjee. his novel Chowringhee, translated by Arunava Sinha in the original novel is 1962. Yusuf Atılgan's Anayurt Otelli, the Turkish novel 1973, Motherland Hotel, translated, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago. And then finally, a novel which has yet to be translated into English, Guillermo Fadinelli's Hotel de Fe, a Mexican novel from 2010. And really sort of what I'll be interested in here is like examining what the function of a hotel is in these narratives, what role it has, what implications, political, psychological, existential, to what extent hotel narratives, and in particular from these three very different regions, reflect certain transcultural patterns of modernity, transcultural mechanisms of modernity's project. And when I say when I say hotel narratives here, really what I mean is a text which has the hotel as the center of its narrative, as the hotel narrative is not simply a narrative which has a hotel playing a function in a background or peripheral way. There's a host of other stories like this. Roberto Bolaño's 2666, the first volume, starts in a hotel. There's Elena Garro's Memories of Things to Come, a Mexican novel which has the Hotel Jardin as a kind of Edenic sort of site within the novel, and of course in other texts as well across. In Turkish literature, for example, Tomris Uyar's Guests of the Dying Hotel can be considered a hotel narrative, as is, and people won't know this text, but Adalet Ağoğlu's Ölmeye Yatak, sort of lying down to die. It's not been translated into English, but it is a novel set, largely a suicide novel set in a hotel, and so on and so forth. So we're really sort of looking at novels which revolve, or short stories which revolve around the idea of the hotel in a kind of referential way as well. They stage, if you like, they foreground the device of the hotel. And these, of course, I should just finally add, these novels are all based on, well, in physical cases, in all three cases on physical hotels. Shankar's Chowringhee, the novel is based on the hotel Shahjahan, a fictitious hotel but based on a real hotel in the heart of Calcutta. Yusuf Atılgan's Motherland Hotel is a fictitious hotel but based in a town probably in present-day Manisa in Western Turkey, where Atılgan grew up. And Guillermo Fadinelli's Hotel Isabel is also set in the middle of DF, the acronymic name for Mexico City, Distrito Federal. We'll start with Shankar's Chowringhee. So, like Shankar's Chowringhee is a funny, interesting, brilliantly written novel, which tells the tale of the narrator Shankar, who gets a job working in one of the largest hotels in the immediate aftermath of the Raj in the 1950s. And I think like it has been it was the subject of a very famous film. It got produced, I think, a 1968 film. And I think it has been called sort of India's corporate story, but I think that does a disservice to the much more ambivalent relationship to capitalism that you get in the text. So even though, of course, ultimately the authority, particularly given the sentimentality which is sometimes given to the Hotel Shahjahan in the text, the kind of the ultimate legitimacy of the idea of a five-star hotel is never really called into the question. nevertheless, there are sort of extremely sort of acidic moments where Shankar really sort of suggests that there's references to a kind of poison that the hotel oozes, that it has an almost corrosive atmosphere on whoever works in it and lives in it. And I'll get to this a little bit later, but there's even a sense in which there's something quasi-supernatural about the hotel. I'm not dramatizing that. It's not a supernatural text, but there is something about the number of deaths that are connected with the hotel, which I think in many ways highlights a much more materialist and cynical attitude towards the concentration of capital, which obviously a five-star hotel like that represents. I think the most obvious thing to say about the idea of the hotel here is that you get the idea of the hotel here as a tomb of empire, perhaps, is the first thing to say. That in Chowringhie's novel, the protagonist is the last, he's unemployed, he was the clerk of the last English barrister of the Raj before independence came. The owner's name is Marco Polo. He has a resemblance to Churchill. There's all kinds of ways in which empire, and not just British empire, but also kind of Mughal and permeates. Now, we'll see this also in other texts. So in the Turkish novel, the Motherland Hotel will basically be an Ottoman palace from the Tanzimat period. And we'll also see this in Hotel des Fées, because even just the name of the hotel, Hotel Isabel, yeah, the Queen of Spain, who with Ferdinand discovered, so to speak, the Nuevo Mundo, the New World. All of these kind of imperial echoes will be in all three texts. But certainly in Chowringhie, you do get this sense of the hotel Shahjahan as a kind of last tenuous link to the dying Raj. So, and almost a space in which the literally post-colonial atmosphere of the Raj, with its muffins and English tea and English menus and, Indian workers called Johnny and Roger and Sally, persists inside this almost in a kind of sepulchral way. Actually, let's do underline that. Let's have a quick look at the some examples here. The centuries-old spirit Shotobdi Prochina Atma of Shahjahan Hotel kept asking even louder, why are you here? Who are you? Why are you here? Life, youth, and everything else in this city are transitory. Nothing can defy eternity and keep standing in Calcutta. But Shahjahan Hotel stands upright with unbelievable arrogance. It survives Teak-Takabe. And not even Simpson, the hotel founder, could have imagined that it would have withstood the ravages of time and lasted so long. And then a third quote. We went to the lower circular road cemetery. Flowers in hand, we entered that silent city of the dead. None of the boys of William Lane was probably alive anymore, but Shahjahan Hotel lived on, eternally young, beckoning the hungry, the thirsty, and the lustful with its bewitching charm. I think what I'd like to sort of stress in this is is really sort of the sense of the undead, the idea that empire persists in a kind of lurid, obscene fashion. And I am thinking here openly of Freud and the notion of the death drive here, and the idea that there's something about the spirit of empire which is sort of obscene and lewd and persists in its own almost lugubrious obstinacy. And it does really make me think as well, just like as I say that, it does make me think of Lacan's idea that authority and obscenity are somehow linked, that obscenity is like the unspeakable underside of authority. And certainly there is something sort of, you get this sense of this in the Hotel Shahjahan. And as I said, it's even sense that these physical places take on an almost uncanny atmosphere, an uncanny feeling in this respect. A second thing I just want to say about Chowringhee before I go on to the next novel is that another aspect of this really is the idea of misogyny. So the idea of the hotel as a femicidal space. And again, you find this in all three novels. So in Hotel des Fées is a hotel where there is sort of, not apart from the murder of one of the guests, Sophia, there's also this sense that it's a hotel which is regularly used for sex trafficking and murder of women. And then, of course, in the Turkish novel, the pivotal moment which changes the hotel owner and turns him into a kind of maniac is his murder of the chambermaid. But certainly the misogyny is also in Shankar's Chowringhee. And I would argue that although it is a very funny novel, and it's a brilliantly funny novel, some of the darkest subtexts in the novel are the way the sort of underage prostitution that takes place, and where the hotel owners are trying to get dancing girls and making sure they're as young as possible, but also the various ways in which female workers in the story are killed or commit suicide. And again, it does suggest that there's something not just patriarchal, but sort of femicidally patriarchal about the idea of the hotel. And maybe sort of not wholly unrelated to the sort of point I just made previously about the lurid undead feel of the hotel as a topos. Excuse me for a second. So that brings us really sort of onto the second novel, which is Yusuf Atılgan's Anayrt Oteli, or Motherland Hotel. And this is a novel which was written in 1973. And kind of like Chowringhee, it was the subject of a very famous Turkish film in 1980. So both texts sort of lent themselves to cinema quite successfully. I think the main thing to say about Motherland Hotel with respect to the other two, that it is a much darker novel compared to the other two novels. So whereas even in terms of the hotels, whereas the Hotel Isabel and the Hotel Shahjahan are flourishing city centre institutions, certainly what we get in the case of the and in city centre institutions that sort of attract a lively a lively clientele and a diverse clientele. Possibly the Motherland Hotel is a little bit more seedy. It's in the back of a railway station in a provincial town in sort of post-war Turkey. The customers that come through its doors are usually they're either prostitutes or unmarried couples or homosexuals. So it's definitely sort of highlighting the more transgressive aspects that we might associate with a hotel. Like Chowringhee, it starts out in a comic way because the hotel manager, the hotel owner, Zeberjet, is a classic case of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And the first third of the novel documents quite comically the extent to which he has these special routines, and all the he puts various things in various pockets, and the meticulous way with which he observes these, pathological way in which he observes these routines. And very interesting as well how all the legal above board things he puts into his right pocket, all the kind of haram, morally dubious things go into his left pocket. There's a sort of very interesting set of ways in which the pathology of the hotel owner, and this of course then becomes very unfunny, because the chambermaid, whose services sexually he has always enjoyed, is suddenly murdered by him in a peak of rage, primarily because another very beautiful woman whom Zeberjet has fallen in love with at first sight promises she'll come back on the next train from Ankara and never arrives. And the crushing disappointment of this, ontologically, if you like, causes his world to collapse. And what you get in the second half of the novel is a series of increasingly bizarre, maniacal gestures as Zeberjet basically mentally dissolves. Now, I've said that, but I guess what we see here, one of the things I'd like to suggest here is the use of the hotel here as a secular space, okay? So the use of the hotel here as a place which, perhaps not even just a secular space, but a godless space. The idea of the hotel as a place which resists religion. We've seen this in both of the other novels. Chowringhee, the Hotel Shahjahan, there's only one religious character, Nitya Hari, who goes around singing Kali Ma Kali. And he's really the only religious figure in an otherwise extremely secular novel. And also, when we get to Hotel des Fées, the only religious moment there is a sort of like a sort of pseudo-Catholic moment of vision, as the narrator describes, one of the narrators describes the girl of their dreams and how she appeared in an apparition to him. But otherwise, both novels are very much rested on an animosity, one might say, almost towards any notion of the religious and any notion of the other world. And this is certainly seen in Motherland Hotel as well. The hotel is, and what do I mean when I say the hotel is a secular space? This is partly seeing the hotel as a development of modernity, as something which perhaps even offers services which parallel religion, sort of the idea of a community, the idea of a self-mythologizing entity, the idea of a venue where one might find refuge. But I think also what obviously lies within this is a sense of the kind of nihilism which perhaps results from the secession of the withdrawal of the subject from a community. So the creation of a kind of, if you like, God-proof pocket where one might take refuge from the outside laws of religion and modernity and morality. And you very much get this sense. And of course, in a Turkish novel, this coincides with the establishment of the Turkish Republic. So getting culturally specific here for a moment, because it does go through all novels, but certainly in Atılgan's case, there is an explicit series of allusions here to the Cumhuriyet, to the Turkish Republic. The Motherland Hotel, unsurprisingly, is founded in 1922, same year as the Republic. And there is definitely a sense, there's a portrait of Ataturk in the wall. There's definitely a sense in which some kind of very uncomfortable illusion and metaphor of the secular republic is being played out in this form of a hotel, of a failed hotel in many ways. And a hotel which seems to attract rather homicide and suicide, because the owner hangs himself in the end in the hotel. Definitely this idea of the hotel as the antithesis of religion and religious narrative. And then secondly, perhaps we could also sort of, and if I may just briefly add, Siegfried Kracauer wrote a famous text on the hotel. Yeah, it's actually called, it's an essay called The Hotel Lobby, but where he basically argues that die Hotelhalle, where he argues that the hotel might be considered almost the inversion of the image of God's house. You know, a place where we would congregate, but with no overarching transcendental vision to bring us together. So and that text is as early as, ironically, 1922. So very early on, people were glimpsing, there's nothing new about this idea of the structure of the hotel as somehow having very secular metaphysical possibilities. And then I think I'll mention another thing about the novel before I go on to the third novel. But we do see as well an emphasis on the concept of history, and indeed even in the practice of history in all three of these novels. So one of the characters in Hotel des Fées, Laura Ghibellini, is a historian. In Shahjahan, in Chowringhee, there's a very curious sense that all the way through the novel, one of the strains of the novel is a constant, almost archival obsession with the history of the hotel. And even there's almost something quasi-theological about the way we never really meet the English founder. He's kind of mythologized, but all we hear is records about him. So there's a kind of obsession with the history, the chronicling of the hotel. But we certainly see this in this obsession reflected as well in Motherland hotels. So if we look at the, this is a passage sort of from the middle. Registers from the previous years were stored in a chest under the stairs together with some thick history books of his father's, Zeberjet, the hotel owner's fathers, printed in the old Arabic script. Once Zeberjet was out of grade school, his father had taught him this script. Hidden away in the beneath the stairs of this hotel is an old set of ledgers written in Ottoman, obviously Arabic script here. First of all, for people who aren't familiar, this is an explicit reference to the Romanization of the Turkish alphabet, which took place in 1928. So this rupture, this moment of orthographical rupture, where a whole generation was from one day to another was rendered illiterate by the switching of this alphabet. But I think as well, what we're seeing here is that, and this increases as the novel progresses. We see the gradual implosion and then explosion of history in this novel. So, you know, we start out with very little sense of the Motherland Hotel, and we are brought into this world of anecdotes and stories, and we begin to get a much deeper sense of, and it's almost the idea of history as a depth charge here, like these if you like, subversive Arabic scripts, because it was illegal to write in Arabic script after the Reformation change, after the language was switched. There is something about the way in which the hotel becomes a kind of sort of reflection on history, and almost and the hotel is almost a kind of archival space in which history is meditated upon, but not in a healthy fashion, almost in a kind of incestuous fashion. And that really sort of brings me to the third novel that we were going to look at, which is Guillermo Fadinelli's Hotel des Fées, a much more recent novel, came out 10 years ago. There's been, Guillermo Fadinelli is a very prolific writer, so he's written, the last time I checked, he was 11 novels, I'm sorry, and this is his 8th one. He writes what people call, I think it's called literatura basura, sort of garbage literature. So literature which concerns the abject of society, the marginal of society, very much the urban detritus, if you like, of a city. And his novels are sort of famous for exploring this. This novel has had mixed reception. So people like Valerio Luiselli, the famous Mexican writer, has praised it as a voice from the margins. Other critics, I think most notably Diana Palaversic, has argued that it's actually just a book, a very misogynist book, filled with typically male fantasies of the female. But whatever we feel about that, there is very much a sense in which it suggests the idea of the hotel as a melancholic space. So that's probably the main thing I'd like to underline with this. Now that melancholy we find in both, again, making the same point, we find that melancholy in all the novels. I'm not cherry picking here. We find them in all the novels we're looking at. Certainly, there's an incommensurable tristesse to Zebejed and the way sort of he lives in the Turkish novel, in the way he sort of half lives out his unfulfilled life and the melancholy expectations of a life which was never quite realized. And also in Shahjahan, there's definitely a melancholy feel, not just nostalgia, not just this sort of longing for the good old times of the hotel's heyday, but also sort of like the broken dreams of the various people who work within Shahjahan. You know, Karabi, the woman one of the female workers who hopes to marry one of the owners, I think it's the owner's son, or the manager's son, you know, hopes to marry upwards, and when this is sort of denied, she commits suicide. So the suicide and melancholy are definitely veins that seem to belong almost intrinsically to the genre of the hotel novel. And certainly here, we find this to be a very melancholic space. I would say primarily because the characters and Hotel des Fées has a whole panoply of characters and a real diverse range of characters socioeconomically. So, you know, you have drug dealers, you have prostitutes, you have academics, you have really sort of a whole gamut of demographics. But many of these characters are very sort of frustrated, fixating hopelessly on goals outside their means, trying to recover things which are irrecoverable, trapped in difficult relationships. And certainly the epitome of this is the protagonist, whose name is Frank Henestrosa. And I'll even we'll have a quick look at and Frank is in many ways, I would say, a very saturnine protagonist. He has a melancholy air about him. And certainly, what he has in common with the other characters is that there's almost a sense of what Heidegger called Geworfenheit in these characters, that the various characters in the novel, and they're all, and what I'm talking about here, all the guests in the Hotel des Fées, in the Hotel Isabel, almost feel like they're thrown into the world. They're sort of centerless and drifting and random. Here's a couple of quotes to show the character of Frank, and this is the protagonist. If I wasn't a hypocrite, I would help the chambermaid to do the cleaning. But if I did, I would lose her respect. What am I looking for? I don't know, perhaps my own face. In front of an old mirror on the wall that suddenly reflects the reception of the Hotel Isabel, I observe my own sad image. Observo mi triste imagen. If I didn't have money on me, it would probably depress me just seeing this orderly, modest gentleman. And who doesn't get depressed at my age? And certainly what we're seeing here is the idea of the hotel as an alienating space, as a space which I was about to say affords introspection, but in many ways sort of imposes or inflicts a melancholic introspection upon the guest, partly through their physical isolation, but of course, partly through the sort of psychological and mental isolation which sort of occupying these small room entails. And there is this sort of dissolution of identity that we get in several of the characters. So I think I'm interested in this, the way the hotel is seen as emblematic of incurring these kind of modern crises of the subject. And the way they're sort of existentially blended together in this novel to provide a larger comment on Mexican society. And I think in many ways as well, getting back to religion, on the idea of a fallen world. So we have very much a godless world here. In the hotel lobby, the Queen Isabel is removed by the end of the story. Yeah, so it's almost sort of explicitly a sort of theocidal moment where we have a hotel Isabel without its Isabel. But the world of centerless, very much of centerless crime. We hear lots of crimes going on, but we're not quite sure who is doing what to whom. It happens on the second floor. And it reminds me in many ways, there's a wonderful Jose Emilio Pacheco short story about, amongst other things, someone who digs a tunnel and discovers a corpse in this tunnel. And the idea that whenever you dig a tunnel in Mexico, you always come across two other tunnels. Yeah. Whenever you try to investigate a crime, you come across 2 or 3 crimes that you're not looking for. So this idea of a world is intrinsically lost, beyond any kind of moral order or moral recoverability. And certainly the Hotel des Faits in these moments sort of communicates this in a very sort of, as I've said, a very sort of saturnine way. And I guess it does make you wonder why inject, as writers, why inject this sense of melancholy into the hotel novel? And I would say that, and I'm just looking at the time here because I don't want to go on too much. And I would say there's almost a sense of mimetic compensation here, that there's something about the melancholic atmospheres that are injected into these hotel stories. It reminds me actually of Deleuze's idea of the Baroque. Deleuze talks about the multiple chambers of the Baroque, whether it's in Leibniz, whether it's in Bach, whether it's in the sort of chamber, in the morning play, the various ways of chambers. And Deleuze, I think, argues that the Baroque is the last attempt to restore the broken, shattered fragments of the classical before it's lost completely. And you get a sense here, perhaps, that in the multiple chambers of these hotel narratives and the melancholy they instill, again, we see this idea of an attempt to recover some sort of sense of order. And how am I doing for time, by the way? I'm launching. Am I okay for time?
Oh, you're good.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just. I won't go on for longer. Yeah, I won't. I'll really try.
I think you're doing fine. I mean, you can carry on.
Okay, I don't want to get kicked out of the hotel before for overstaying my checkout. But the idea of what we're really gravitating towards here, actually, is the idea that there's some kind of relationship between death and the hotel in literature, I think. That there's some sort of connection or some sort of fundamental constitutive relationship between death and hotels, literary hotels, when we encounter them in literary texts. I mean, and we can just hop around the Western canon and we know this much, right? The Gresham in James Joyce's The Dead, the Hotel des Bains, I think, in Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, Doris Lessing's To Room 19. And then, of course, we find these in the regional literatures as well. So there's some sort of connection here, like I say, something almost thanatological about the motif of the hotel. And why? So, I mean, there's definitely local reasons we could give in each of these cases, right? We could certainly suggest that in the case of Shahjahan, we're looking at the death of the British Empire and the various literary ways in which, wittingly or unwittingly, the spirit of the Raj is trying to resurrect itself in this text. So literally a text in the wake of empire. In the case of Turkey, again, we could look at the ways in which the Ottoman Empire was often, I don't know if this is a word, but was often thanatologized, like was often seen as synonymous with death. And certainly the idea of the ghost of the Ottoman Empire spectrally persisting in this hotel, and even perhaps a kind of on a different note, a kind of comment on the suicidal nature of secular modernity that perhaps Atılgan is making about the Kemalist modernizing project. You know, the fact that the hotel owner in the end kills himself, and killed himself at the exact time and day of Atatürk's funeral. Again, would suggest some sort of political comment here, linking death and secular modernity. And then finally, I think, with the Mexican novel, there is a whole sort of an extant criticism, I think most famously Claudio Lomnitz, who talks about the way Mexico, his book Death and the Idea of Mexico is a classic text on the way, how does he put it? I think the nationalization of death in Mexican society. So the way death has been sort of taken on almost by Mexican society and incorporated as a kind of motif. Xavier Villarrutia, the Mexican poet, famously said, life is a nostalgia for death. We could go on there. It's a very lugubrious train, but my point is that you could find sort of local specific reasons why for this sort of the synonymy perhaps of death and the literary hotel. But I think as well, there are for me at least, there are two theoretical avenues. The first would be a psychoanalytical one. So you would see, if the hotel is seen as a sexually transgressive place, yeah, as we've already, I think, made clear, you know, it's a place where you go if you want to have sort of extramarital sex or prostitution or homosexuality, then the text here might almost be seen in a psychoanalytical way as punishing the transgression, okay, a textual sort of punishing. And it's interesting, you see this particularly in Shahjahan, how all of the moments where some kind of boundary is overstepped by the female protagonist, they are murdered. I don't mean, not necessarily murdered by other people, but the author, if you like, textually murders them. And of course, and I think another bow to that would be that all three protagonists of these novels are sort of like sexually frustrated, impotent, weak men. And that violence, the culminating death that drives these texts may well have, again, some kind of psychoanalyzable relationship to them. Just speaking very obviously there. I think another avenue, though, might be historicizing, a historicizing attitude towards the secular. So seeing the hotel, if you like, if you can think of a fictional approach to the project of secular modernity, something which sees in the structure of the hotel an almost allegorical version of the nation or the country. And these allegorical allusions are explicitly in all three texts, and not just in these texts, but others, but definitely in the three texts I'm looking at. All three hotels are at various points associated with India or with Mexico or with Turkey. Then there may be here a sort of a comment on the kind of nihilism which ultimately sort of culminates within these projects. So it's almost like the hotel is a kind of experimental petri dish in which the processes of the secular are examined and ultimately sort of led to a kind of mortal conclusion. So I think I'm going to wind up with that. Thank you very much for keeping up with my talk, and I'm happy to sort of answer any questions that any people may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ian Almond, for your insights. I'm sure the audience are now bubbling with questions. So dear audience, feel free to voice your thoughts, or you can also type out your questions here. And Dr. Sharkar Hassan Al-Zayed, the Associate Professor of ULab, will moderate the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Radia. Is there any question, or should I just jump in? Thank you very much, Ian. I mean, very happy to have you back at ULab, and this has been a wonderful demonstration of your scholarship and your innovative reading. I mean, the epithet creativity or creative is hardly applied or used in case of a critic, but being a translator of your work, I know how wonderfully creative your readings are most often. So thank you for your wonderful reading of these 3 novels. And I found many of those discussions, wonderfully enlightening. Let's see if we have any question. If there is not, I have tons of things to kind of place before you.
Yeah, just before, if people as well have any sort of Bangladeshi suggestions for hotel narratives, or I'd be more than happy to hear those as well. I think there's a hotel I was reading Saeed Manzarul Islam's Absurd Night, Ajgubi wrote, and I think there's a hotel at the beginning of that, and obviously it's a feminicidal novel as well. But anyway, sorry to interrupt you, Saeed. Yeah.
One of the most interesting things that
Okay. So there's a question in the chat room. So Shafiq has a question.
Okay. The question is, it's a wonderful talk. The idea of hotel drawn from the 3 novels from 3 different locations is interesting. The sense of alienation and godlessness and the idea of femicidal space are fascinating. I have just one simple query. Are these reflections homogeneous about the idea of hotel? There are various categories and kinds of hotels. So what would be your point about that?
Yeah, and I do briefly say that at the beginning, but I completely agree that they are, and not just homogeneous in terms of like the the tier of hotel, if you like, but also that the contexts are very different. Okay, so the historical contexts are very different. I mean, we have. If we're talking about political processes, we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about the post-colonial Indian state, and we're talking about Kemalist modernity. Those are 3 very, very different sets of, I mean, they may be modernities of a kind, but they are very different historical, they are arguably somewhat different historical processes. Leaving aside as well, perhaps sort of like cultural ideas of what a caravanserai or what a tavern might be, and so on and so forth. But I guess like this touches on a bigger debate within world literature, because there's certainly a set of people, and I will consider myself amongst them, but people like the Warwick Research School, like Frankie Moretti, who argue that even though we have a wide diversity of contexts, and no one's denying that, there are certain patterns of modernity, of alienation, which are recurring whether it's 1950s Calcutta, whether it's 1970s Istanbul, whether it's 1910 Dublin, right? There are certain sort of patterns of modernity which are tentatively transcultural and transhistorical. And that doesn't mean that these novels can be reduced to mere exemplar. But it does mean that what I'm looking at here is trying to delineate very tentatively commonalities, because we could spend all day talking about the differences. And I'm not. I'll address your question though, because your question is even within whether there's a difference sort of in terms of class, right? Even within the same culture. And I would say there is. I would say that the idea of alienation, for example, still takes place regardless of whether it's a 5-star hotel or a 2-star hotel. I'd say the idea of acquiring some kind of privacy, whether it's a bourgeois privacy or a proletarian privacy, I would say that the possibilities for pleasure, for illicit pleasure, whilst not completely the same, you do get the similar, structurally similar sort of possibilities for that. But it's a very good point that, the idea that if I'm not reading too much into the person's question, that there is something class related about this, which is overlooked perhaps in the analysis, right?
I think, you definitely touched upon that topic, right? So you're basically reading these novels allegorically, not simply literally, but seeing them as broader allegories of the changes that are taking place in a particular society, and then noticing this homology. So if we go back to Jameson and one of his more recent works, Allegory and Ideology, where he suggests that all these modernist fictions are allegorical, and the broader contour of the world is kind of organized in a way that is beyond this subjective difference. And, things happen in that, arranged and organized way. And that arrangement is obviously through these capitalist relations of power in some ways. And at the same time, and I feel that, and this is where your reading gets really, really intriguing, through this, patriarchal, femicidal, tendency, which gets, blurted out, almost in the form of a traumatic recognition of what is lost and what is kind of recovered in certain ways, and what is lamented for.
Could I just respond very quickly to the with the Jameson? Obviously, in the book I engage with Jameson, and I think there's a feeling that the backlash towards his essay on third world literature was some people have all called it a hysterical backlash. Like, I definitely don't think we should homogenize third world writers but there was a kind of almost dismissive. For many years, you couldn't even cite that essay because there was such, there had been such a post-colonial pushback on that. And I think now, as you've said, I think people are sort of looking at Jameson a little more soberly and realizing that he's talking about the way material mechanisms produce analogous feelings of trauma, analogous sort of concentrations of capital. I guess the only thing I would say is that I added I would not argue that Mexican, Turkish, and Bengali writers have something sort of homogeneous which they enjoy by virtue of their being sort of peripheral or semi-peripheral. And that's why I added the Western canon at the end there. That this would extend to Joyce and Mann as well, right? Yeah. Okay. While the other person asks the next question, I'm switching my AC.
Yes. There's
There's a
another
from
question.
Mashir.
Moshir, who has asked you, I mean, intrigued by the talk in many ways. I would like to hear a lot more things about several topics you touched upon, especially how you related authority with obscenity and how you put the point of suicidal nature of secular modernity and how the hotel narratives present these things. When you were talking, I was thinking about hotels are the places where the fragmented individuals take refuge, who otherwise holds an impression of unified personality. What's your take on it?
So I got the obscenity authority thing, but the last point, that the idea that the hotel is a refuge for people with
a place where fragmented individuals take refuge. So probably in a, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that would be as Krakauer points out, right? That would be like the material alternative of community to the kind of metaphysical compensation which an ummah or a congregation would afford, right? I mean, that's really sort of what the hotel in many ways represents. I think if you're going to argue, as I do, if you're going to argue for the hotel as a secular development, not just in the sense that it materially provides an alternative to community. Yeah, you no longer stay with your relatives or with people you believe, but you stay, you impersonally, through credit, hire a box for a night or 2 nights. Then it's not just that material basis, that there's something about the way these places begin to sort of mythologize themselves. We see this in all 3 texts, but especially like in Shahjahan, in Chowringi. The way, and I think you see this much more so in the corporate world today, the way there's a kind of brand sublimity which is cultivated, and then which almost has a kind of religiosity of its own. And the idea that by staying in the Marriott or in the Hilton, you're not just staying in a room, but you're purchasing an experience, you're purchasing an identity. I think that's what I get from the idea of the hotel emerging as a kind of alternative to religious, a secular, this worldly alternative to kind of religious experience. With the obscenity authority thing, that would, I mean, I could repeat it, but it's basically Lacan's point that, and it goes back to Freud as well, right? There's something about the original patriarch, which is founded on an original act of incest and an original act of taboo. Yeah, so there's a kind of complicit collusion with the obscene, and that this explains why for Lacan the authority is always this profoundly ambivalent power. It's the, if you like, it's the school teacher who slaps you in the face in one hand and winks at you and gropes you with another. You know, there's this sort of deeply disturbing and deeply discomforting coexistence of these 2, if you like, these 2 drives. So that would really be sort of Lacan's point.
I find that at this historical juncture, we are very much aware of the obscenity of power, how obscene it gets and kind of constantly parades itself in today's world. So it requires no further elaboration, right? Literally, there are figures who embody that obscenity in each and every single way that you get to. On the one hand, for people stay home, and then they venture out, I mean, and they party at night, right?
Well, I think,
I sense there's a local subtext here, but
well, obscenity and beauty also, hang together. I think. By the way, Ian, there's a new film version of Chowringi. based
okay.
on Chowrangi, and the title is Shahjahan Regency.
Oh,
It's just it's come out, I think. The director is Srijit Mukherjee.
okay.
I think
So,
it's more sensational in certain aspects, but it's worth watching. Yeah, and I was fascinated by the way of the three hotels together. And of course, they're all three. I mean, all of them seem to be hotels of a particular kind. I mean, they have history. There's an accretion of history in each of these. And I was thinking of how different the situation is today globally, where you have, these hotels which are the same everywhere in every city. Everything is very synthetic and all that. It's a bit like, the old publishing houses, independent publishing houses being taken over by these big, corporate bodies. And so there's a kind of homogenization. So a five-star hotel in Dhaka and in Singapore and London, they all have the same sort of attributes, which you don't find in these three hotels. I mean, these are actually, we're actually talking about an era that is already gone in a sense.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess like the only thing that would keep it present, and I guess Hotel des Fées, obviously, because it's 2010 is the closest there, is that we're talking about post-colonial modernities, Kemalist modernities, but then by the time we get to what you're talking about, we're talking about the neoliberal melancholy of modernity. Yeah, so we're really kind of in a post-ideological age where very much sort of Fukuyama style, that there's this sort of like directionless, centerless landscape which is presented with us, and which in many ways, like at least I feel that the hotel tries to address, like the hotel in all various ways, and we've all been to, these hotels that are sort of characterless, and the more they try to present some kind of authenticity, the more depressing it is.
Right.
There's some sort of like, and it does make me think of Alain Badiou's idea of atonal worlds. So Badiou has this notion of Badiou, I think, basically argues that capitalism is essentially anarchic, that and that one of the things that is endlessly creating and destroying is historical context, so that the late capitalist subject is robbed of any kind of historical depth of the world, is robbed of any kind of way of engaging in a meaningful way with the world, because context is constantly annihilated.
Yeah.
You probably see the culmination of this in these sort of lounges, these sort of like amorphous, with your jazz music background and your, sort of bamboos and water thing going on in the corner. Like there's something sort of deeply, I was going to say postmodern, but postmodern would be like, in Nietzsche's sense, would be the cheerful nihilism. But this is a kind of...
it's sort of a kind of a transient kitsch, as it were. But, to go back to the three hotels and this wonderful sort of presentation of yours. I was thinking of Bangladesh in relation to these three cities, these three hotels. Bangladesh has actually been out of this whole phenomenon, because the difference between Calcutta and Dhaka, if you think of the colonial situation, it's they're worlds apart. We didn't have any hotels here which are in any way comparable to to Shahjahan Regency or any of the other hotels. And so the hotel in Bangladesh, I think, again, that would be an interesting sort of thing to study. And we've had sort of boarding houses, small hotels. The only fairly decent hotel was not good enough for a film crew which wanted to come to Dhaka. But I think one film crew did manage to get here, because I think one scene in Around the World in 80 Days was shot in Sylhet, if I'm not wrong.
Okay.
Okay. But, we have boarding houses, which again, have a similar kind of association with melancholy and that. And the growth of modernism in Bangladeshi literature is closely tied to a few places like beauty boarding. The next time you're in Dhaka, we'll take you there. It's in old Dhaka. It is a small hotel. There are a few rooms, but it's basically a sort of a cafe, in old Dhaka. And that is where all these Shahid Qadri and Shamsur Rahman and others used to congregate. And there was a place called Hotel Blue Nile, which is also in old Dhaka. So they played the role of the left bank cafes,
Right.
and or the coffee house in Calcutta. And the Bangladeshi modernism is actually rooted in these little institutions, which are now dying, actually, and nothing has taken their place.
You're making me think about the relationship between peripherality and the hotel, because
And you also have the Shahbag Hotel.
Sorry?
No, sorry, I was saying that, we had Shahbag Hotel, which got transformed into a hospital.
Yes.
Yeah, and Intercontinental was the only decent hotel, right? In the Pakistan.
There was Intercontinental Hotel, right? I mean, before the independence as well.
The Intercontinental was set up in
has
the
a role to play in 1971.
1960s. And I think the Intercontinental is probably the only Bangladeshi hotel which is mentioned in a classic work of English literature, in a play by Tom Stoppard. I forget the title, I've got it noted down somewhere. There's a line he says, one journalist comes to Dhaka to cover this country, and in the men's room, he sort of sees a bit of graffiti, one journalist to another. Dick Richard before he dicks you. that has found its way into Tom Stoppard play and mentions the Intercontinental in Dhaka. But the Shahbag Hotel was the best hotel we had here before these new five-star international hotels arrived in the 60s. And that was not considered good enough, really, by foreign Western film crew who wanted to come here.
It's always it's always the idea of the hotel as some kind of moniker or some kind of barometer of progress, though, isn't it? Yeah, it's all this.
Yeah, and then to think of the symbolic role. I mean, the Ritz. I mean, you mentioned the Ritz, and at once you conjure up this picture of glamour and London and all that. And so you have different types of hotels, different types of symbols. You think of the Algonquin in New York, where all these writers used to live, actually, spent years there and doing much of their great work. It's interesting to sort of extend the study and see how all the different ramifications of hotel life, and the associations of hotels with culture, have the way they have played out.
There is one short story by Jyoti Prakash. Sorry, sir. Sir, if you want to ask a question or say something, it's totally fine. I'll talk after you do.
No, I wanted to the idea that so movie or adding to the hotel business is the Tomb Raider. Angelina Jolie, and after the movie, the whole Siam Reap changed, and the entire hotel landscape changed in, so in Cambodia. So that was amazing. But going back to the idea of, so hotel as a secular place, and it's interesting, last year I went for Umrah, Hajj in Mecca, and you have the clock tower hotels, so the 5-star hotels. And that, of course, is not a secular hotel. And so you have only one TV channel that shows the Hajj, 24/7. One of the floor space is dedicated for prayer. So it is aligned with the Kaaba, Sharif, and all that. So it was interesting when you were talking about hotel as a secular space. So I was thinking, like, what about the religious tourism? And if you have the hotels in the vicinity, how does it influence the nature of a hotel? So that would be like, one question. And the other thing that I was thinking in terms of the allegory that you mentioned with reference to Chorungi, why did Shankar refuse to mention the political climate? So he has all these names like, Marco Polo and others trying to make it very cosmopolitan, but he was not, referring to any of the politics of the 1950s, in Chorungi. So I was wondering, like, so do you have any take on that?
Okay, so first of all, with the religious hotels, I think that's a great observation. When you think about the first hotels, they would have been pilgrimage. The first tourism would have been pilgrimage, right? So the first, and that's really sort of where we get the first reason. The trade and pilgrimage are the two reasons why people left their communities to go abroad. So it's great that you pointed out, because the caravanserai or the various sort of pilgrims taverns in Europe would have been that original. So it's the idea of this world religiously is a hotel, right? We pass through it. All of the novel, well, particularly Shankar's novel, explicitly references this. Yeah, the world is a hotel. You don't know how long you're going to stay, but you'll have to check out. So definitely, like the religious hostel, you could almost invert it and say that the hotel has something religious about it as its raison d'etre, right? The hotel is a literalization of how you should view your time in this world. But secondly, with Shankar, I don't know. I read part of his. I think he wrote a book on. It wasn't Sri Aurobindo. It was another scholar. But he was a very sort of. I don't claim to be an expert on Shankar. But I agree that it is sort of striking that there's hardly any topical references, political references in the text. And I think it does, to some extent, I think one of the reasons might have been that there is, I won't say explicitly, but there is a kind of commitment to the memory of the Raj in the way he participates in the memorialization of the Shahjahan. And it's the kind of commitment which, in a way, runs in the face of Indian nationalist modernity. And then doubling on that, the fact that we're talking about a 5-star hotel, I think there's a politically conservative subtext there. I think there's certainly, I think that's, for me, that is maybe the central reason why he doesn't engage with any kind of sort of contemporary politics. Both a commitment to the Raj, but also the commitment to the kind of capital which, to put it bluntly, stayed pretty much intact when the transition took place. Does that make sense?
No, it's actually early 1960s, right? The 1963, you said.
Yes.
So before the political atmosphere started hotting up. So when he wrote it, things were still pretty stable. The Congress was in control. It's only after the mid-60s that the communist movement and the Naxalites and all.
Yeah, I assumed that Shamsad was saying that. I'm not talking about quit India or anything like that. I assumed you were talking about the immediate aftermath of independence, right? The 50s and 60s, yeah?
Yeah. And yeah. And immediately after independence, I mean, for a few years, I mean, Calcutta was just a pretty stolid place, in decline, politically, nothing exciting happening. The Congress was in control. And then in the late 60s, we have this sudden explosion and the Naxalite generation. Yeah.
West Bengal, right? Right, the Naxalite. Right.
Yeah.
So that was pretty prominent. Right? But it's interesting because in terms of the narrative of, you have the, Decameron or Canterbury Tales kind of narrative in Chorungi, like, all the stories, like, you can almost anywhere. So, it has that, religious pilgrimage kind of setting, especially Shujata Bose coming in, the air hostess and all that. So if all the stories coming together, and also, thinking of the Airbnbs, so do you think the emergence of Airbnbs will change the new narrative, for that matter? And at the same time, I'm curious about your take on the Grand Budapest, the movie.
Right, yes.
Have you watched the movie Grand Budapest?
Yes, I have,
Yeah.
I'm a big Wes Anderson fan. I think that the Airbnb again will, my feeling, having like many of you stayed in Airbnbs, is that it sort of accelerates this already fragmentation of whatever collective experience was left over from the modern hotel, right? That individually, capitalism is outsourcing and privatizing and relocating all of our collective experiences into individual ones, and goes hand in hand with this sort of the way in which we are given sort of mindscapes of personal trajectory and personal spiritual progress, right? When you go, this from your own Airbnb experience, you get a list of all the Airbnbs you've been to, and you begin to see a kind of, you're getting your own story. So I do see something very, very 21st century about that trend. Because the thing I mean, I don't want us to move into sort of banalities, but I guess the thing I miss about using Airbnb more and more is that it is fun to go to a hotel. It is fun to bump into people and be forced into proximity, pre-COVID, be forced into proximity with people whom you completely meet on a random basis. And Airbnb, like Netflix, algorithmically takes that out of the equation. You're increasingly being encouraged to follow your own sort of proclivities. And then what was the second one you just asked? You asked
about the Grand Budapest.
Yes. So again, that would really get back to empire and the nostalgia for empire. I mean, Stefan Zweig, famously sort of lamented sort of the kind of, and let's be frank, the kind of bourgeois multiculturalism which the Habsburg Empire afforded, right? And which sort of the modern, and there are parallels here with Turkey, right? The sort of the Ottoman polyculturalism which would be dissolved in a kind of monocultural Kemalist modernity. So I think I would see that as another example. And goes hand in hand, if you like, although obviously in Central Europe it lapses into a kind of statist fascism. But it does go hand in hand with this kind of nostalgia for a world of lost pleasures, doesn't it really? It's a great film.
Yeah, it is. I loved it. Yeah. So that over to you, sorry.
Shamshad mentioned the pilgrimages, just a second. The pilgrim routes are still very much alive, I think. I had a colleague in Dhaka University who toured all over India in the company of a group of Hindu pilgrims. He's not Hindu, he's a sort of secular Muslim, but he found it a very inexpensive way to see India. So he went around from one holy place to another with them. And in Bangladesh, you have the Tablighi Jamaat, which also is its members sort of go around from place to place, but they don't stay in hotels. I think they stay in the mosques. You just get down wherever they find a mosque and then move on. So that kind of wayfaring life of pilgrims, it's still very much there in the subcontinent.
So you just choose your yatra. Instead of you choosing your Airbnb, you just choose your yatra and then you're set to go, right? You don't need even to make a reservation. You could just, I think those kinds of little rebellions against the digital zeitgeist is going to happen more and more frequently though, right? I mean, I think these kinds of miniature micro resistance to a kind of homogenizing zeitgeist is happening. But it's always on an individual basis, right? People, go off grid, for example. You know, people refuse. You know, more and more people are sort of getting rid of their smartphones or so on and so forth. Sorry, I think I cut somebody off.
Sir? Okay.
Oh, sir, I just wanted to mention that there are two works in Bangladeshi fiction where the hotel features. One of them is this really bizarre kind of weird work of fiction by Shahidul Zahir, Mukher Dike Dekhi, all right, where the protagonist comes back to Dhaka after a long time, you know, and he bizarrely gets lost and then becomes very rich, absolutely ruthless in many ways, kills many people, kind of rises to prominence. So typical neoliberal allegory, but then he comes back to his, you know, old Dhaka place, and his mother declines to recognize him. So he stays in a hotel and kind of plans what he's going to do. So that's one of the examples. The other one is by, you know, Jyoti Prakash Datta. There's a short story called Gram o Shohor Unnayoner Golpo, where you see the hotel. I mean, this Wilbur Schramm, who's kind of the protagonist of this, one of the protagonists of this particular short story, who's basically a developmental worker, modeled after this, you know, iconic figure in communications, you know, and development, right? Wilbur Schramm. So this guy, I mean, you know, who has visited East Pakistan and Bangladesh 4 times, you know, comes back to reside. You know, the hotel is not named, but it resembles Sonargaon Hotel, from which he looks down and he notices all these slums that are down there. So it appears more like this afterlife of this, what you can call, you know, modernist or post-colonial apprehensions of, or, you know, of the hotel narratives, where you have this neoliberal understanding of, you know, the hotels, from which you notice simultaneously these two worlds separated by wealth and want. So I feel that those are two, you know, examples. But you know, Bangladesh.
In the second example, does the hotel remain intact at the end? Like, is there anything? Does it abide?
It does. The guy kind of says that, you know, he's unable to solve the problem of development. You know, he doesn't understand why the rural Bangladesh is not changing despite his efforts. So what he does is kind of, he says that, okay, I'm going to raise it in our next conference. And this is where it ends, basically. So, you know, perhaps the ruin lies down there, probably in the way he gazes at that, you know, slum where, you know, all these big shiny roads are kind of undermined by the reminder that he has not been able to do anything to alleviate the poverty. So,
So that there is a question on the Empire, the chat room. So.
Yeah, I was looking at the chat room myself. Are you talking about the third question, right? By making the hotel a metaphor of both the dying Raj, but also a space that offers the privacy. Second, don't you think the narrative deprived the agency of the local in imagining possible alternatives? The empire, it seems, is just reinvested with new splendor. What is your take on that? It's a great question. So like the narratives rob any kind of agency of.
Do you mind? Sorry, like, can the question setter identify himself or herself? Because it just says iPhone.
Oh, sorry, sir. It's me, Tabassum, from Department of English and Humanities.
Great. Okay. That was my phone. Sorry.
Hello
Ann,
again.
Shamsad, you were troubled by the anonymity of that iPhone. You think it was a Maoist or a,
yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't change my name. Yes. Yeah. I'm utilizing it to the fullest.
Anonymity is good. Anonymity is good. They can't shoot you if you're a sniper. Okay. Yes, I think there is. I think there's something about a fixation on a structure which suggests a kind of conservative, and it's a little bit what Shamsad was saying earlier. I do feel that the hotel narrative is essentially a conservative text, and I don't mean that in a kind of conscious, explicit way. I mean in the sense that it still participates in a certain commitment to the fact of the hotel, to the entity, if you like, of the hotel. I mean, in the case of Chowringhee, I do think there's a kind of repressed Anglophilia, or at least an unarticulated sort of commitment to the legacy of the Raj, even if the actual author wouldn't accept that. And it gets onto sort of like the wider debate of like to the extent to which an author themselves are conservative when it comes to their own texts, because the authors are like, they are the power structure. Yeah, they are the, if you like, they take on the sort of godlike role of these miniature textual hotels that they deliver us. And I think the idea that the construction of that hotel doesn't leave space for any sort of possible alternatives, I have a lot of time for. I think you're right. I think there's something, I mean, it's obviously a truism to say there's something conservative about nostalgia, but there, particularly even in a kind of skeptical, cynical nostalgia like Yusuf Atılgan, you're still sort of problematically chained to the structure that you're, in this case, Kemalist modernity, that you're trying to defame, right? Because the book, in one sense, the Turkish novel, is definitely an attack on Kemalist secularism. Like, it's definitely, if you're a Kemalist, right? If you follow Ataturk, it's a deeply offensive book in so many ways. But at the same time, it's still sort of obsessing with the if you like, the undead object of ideology, isn't it? It's still sort of, instead of like the truly subversive gesture would be to break out across a new vista, break out across a new space. But the fact that it still acknowledges some kind of need. Does this make sense? Was it Cabos? What was it?
Yes, it does. It does.
You know, if you, I don't know if you've looked up Shankar's biography, because he was actually a British barrister's clerk, and his other best-selling book is actually a memoir of his experience as the barrister's clerk, Koto Ojanare.
Oh, yes.
Koto Ojanare. And this nostalgia, I think, is very real. And it is also, I think, to be found in many of the Bengali modernists. I think Malcolm Muggeridge mentions in his memoirs that these great Bengali modernists, you know, they were all nationalists. At the same time, there was this sense of, you know, an elegiac sort of sense of, a momentous era sort of passing into history, and a certain degree of uncertainty about what the future, you know, held. So I think that nostalgia is very real, you know, with that, in that generation.
Yeah, I think that, the new movie that you mentioned, I watched it. There is a particular scene where, it's a very long scene where the hotel closes down. I mean, you can't not think about all this nostalgia and this elegiac feeling that you're talking about.
And I
think sorry, Mahfouz has a question. So if Mahfouz want to, but sorry, finish your thought. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say very cautiously as the kind of random white guy here, but I feel very troubled by some of the sort of elite nostalgia in India for empire. I think it does sometimes come across as elites missing elites. Yeah, elites sort of like. I think there's a very sort of like problematic aspect to that. Thank you, Professor Almond. Transgressive content.
So Mahfouz, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Sure, sir. I was just saying that there's this idea of contact zone as a social space, social space for cultural contact within asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism. So, since Professor Almond mentioned the idea of Geworfenheit or thrownness into the world, so ontologically, can we see the hotel narratives as transitory and transgressive contact zones between Thanatos and libido, Dasein and das Nicht, empire and post-empire, and is that where we get in the interstices of Heimlich and Unheimlich, the canny and the uncanny?
And that's an excellent question. And one of the things I didn't cover, and I left it out because I didn't want to go on and on, was like the way the theoretical canon has dealt with hotels. Foucault, Adorno, Jameson, a number of figures have like, and I guess it really touches on whether you feel the hotel, and Lefebvre, in his classic work on space, would say that the hotel is an extension of dominated space. So the hotel is an absolute vehicle of ideology. So when you check into a hotel, you are colluding in the project of the hotel. You are engaging with it. And I guess the debate there would be whether you feel the hotel is this ideological space. In other words, it's a place belonging to power, or, taking the Foucauldian route, whether you feel it's a place where power happens, which is a different thing, right? Whether it's a site in which different discourses, something like Foucault's heterotopia, right? Where these discourses vie with one another. I think like, well, the sexual aspect there, I think is interesting, because I think from what I've said in the talk, my feeling is that there's something very one-sided about that relationship. This isn't a space in which, you get to know the other and encounter the other. This isn't one of those Homi Bhabha idealized spaces where I engage with the other and then some kind of, interstitial third entity emerges, hybridically from our interaction. These are structures where sort of violence takes place and isolation takes place. And I think that's probably where I would side on this, that there's something quite oppressive about the hotel and about the kind of influence a hotel exerts. Even when we're talking about a hotel where you openly participate as a paying guest, I do think there's something quite one-sided and asymmetrical about that power relationship.
Yeah, I think of Agatha Christie, like most of it. Yeah, so the Agatha Christie, is the mystery novels. So that would be a great example of the uncanny, and as well as Psycho is another Hitchcock movie, where you have this hotel as a space where anything can happen, right?
Right.
So the fear of the unknown, so that can be acted out or enacted in a hotel.
The hotel and the spy thriller.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go.
You can have a lot of fun about imagining hotels killing you in various ways. But I was also thinking, responding to, is it Mahfuzur? Well, I'm sorry, well,
Yes,
Mahfuz,
Mahfuz,
yeah.
yes.
responding to Mahfuzur's question, though, I'm really thinking about the way hotels format their guests more than anything. It's not so much murder, but it's the way we are, as Heidegger would say, the way we are worlded, the way we are selved by a hotel, that I think is more insidious. Yeah. And that's why I don't, and maybe there's a political problem I have here, because I have very little time really for these ideas of like sort of, Homi Bhabha, or even sort of Derridian notions of relationship to the other as some kind of openness in which we can engage and learn about one another. I find them almost idealized versions of relationships to the other, which sort of evacuate, as you have implied in your own question, right? Evacuate very real questions of power, of the imbalance of power and capital, and certainly in the novels I'm dealing with, that imbalance is very clear. There's no exploratory relationship of the other. I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, thank you. It just sort of reminded me of the movie Taxi Driver, directed by Martin Scorsese, where at the end of the movie, Travis Bickle actually shoots everyone, and he sort of familiarizes himself with the other within. So the other within and familiarizing the self with the other within. So that is what I was sort of implying, that, the imbalance between what we have, the self that we have in masks, and the other that we sort of have repressed within us.
Well, so, I mean, Robert De Niro is the frustrated, impotent male there, right? I mean, he is in that.
Yes.
If I remember my De Niro film backlog correctly, he is he's the frustrated. He's angry at the criminality, and then it's this act of possible sexual transgression. I think isn't it one of there's a girl gets abducted or something that sparks this violence at the end. So it would sync with a number of the texts that we've talked about, whether it's Psycho, whether it's the Turkish novel.
Yeah, and that takes place in the hotel as well.
Mm.
Mm. Architecturally, I think the hotel has more in common with the monasteries than other institutions. An inn or a caravanserai has a certain openness, whereas the hotel has some of the architecturally, it has some of the qualities of a monastery. And nowadays, many of the monasteries also function as hotels, offering rooms to people who want to spend a few quiet days in isolation.
Maybe I'm the only conservative here, but I'm horrified by that obscene blurring between the two. But you're quite right. You're perfectly right. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see when you go into hotels, the meditative atmosphere. Obviously you're not meditating on God anymore. You're meditating on the Dow Jones or whatever it is you're following. But they're very sort of thought-inducive moment which is being sort of presented, right?
Yeah, and another hotel that needs to be looked at is the railway hotel, which is a thing of the past now. But there are lots of stories, novels where these railway hotels feature significantly.
Yeah, so the Turkish hotel is a railway hotel, basically. And the first Shafik, I think, was the first points this out. Yeah, that with the economic demographic of the traveler, if you like, is crucial, isn't it, in this?
Yeah.
I hope I'm not being rude, but I do have to slowly go. Like many people on this screen, I imagine. I also have to slowly go.
Your bedtime. No, you are behind us, I think.
All right,
Okay, so
so
Rabia, yeah.
yes, sir.
Rabia?
It has been an undoubtedly and absolutely one insightful discussion. And at this point of the seminar, I would like to invite our honored head of the English department and the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Shamshad Murtuza, PhD, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Rabia, and thank you, Ian. Like, we couldn't have done it without Ian. What an exciting, deliberation we had and the discussion that followed. Amazing. So thank you so much. And often, we run out of ideas, and especially in the, English department, so we tend to, look into the same old things, while discussing about, post-colonialism or post-modernism and all that. So you have actually, given us a space to talk about, and to go back to one of the novels, from our childhood days, Chorangi, and to relive the experience. So so I didn't know about the other two novels, but it was fascinating to know that there are some form of similarities, as Shafiq pointed out at the very beginning. So my job is to thank everyone. I would actually have a sad news to share. So Muntasir Mamun, who was actually organizing this particular event, he lost his daughter, who was only 18 months old, this morning, and that created some sort of confusion. So we are sorry for his loss. So I would like to extend my prayers on behalf of the department to Muntasir and his family during this troubled time. The event committee, Mahmoud, Tanzia, so they pulled it off, and the IT department, so despite all the internet glitches, so they tried their best. And there was a slight confusion in terms of, accessing to the Zoom. I think, many of the outsiders not using ULAB IDs could not enter. So that explains the low turnout, but they had the option of watching it on Facebook. So we will, of course, record this event and post it on YouTube, so that, we can have larger dissemination of this lecture series. So thank you, Kaisa sir. Despite your illness, you have joined in, and all our colleagues and the guests and our students. I know midterm is starting from Sunday. So, and Ian, once again, so thank you. So I know, so you have the Thanksgiving going on, and we probably ruined your holidays. But
No, I'm British. We just give thanks that we got rid of the Puritans.
Yeah.
Have a...
Oh, great. Okay, so we are on that secular space, godless space, as you said. All right.
Honestly,
so thank you so much again.
The honor was all mine. The honor was all mine. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening to me. It's very kind of you.
Thank you, Ian. And you're a great friend of ULAB, as Kaisa said at the very beginning. So
Definitely.
thank you, everyone, and yeah, good night from my side. Okay. So, and hope to see you around. So there's just a workshop on digital humanities on Sunday, and we will be announcing the next lecture series very soon. So thank you and good night.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.
So that brings us to the end of today's seminar. So thank you everyone for joining, and good night. See you all in the next session.
Thank you, Ian. Okay. Thank you, guys, sir. Bye-bye.